Let's have a look at the documentation for Foundation. Here's a link to this page. They recently updated the docs on May 17th, and now there are a bunch of videos. So here's the getting started page on the actual documentation. Here's a link straight to here. We built Foundation for sites to be the most advanced responsive front-end framework in the world. Responsive? Who knows what responsive is? Responsive design? Anybody? Nobody knows? Yeah, Kyle.
It makes it so that when you do it on a smaller screen, everything adjusts.
Yeah, responsive design refers to designing things for screens of different sizes. So Foundation makes it a little easier than it would be to do by hand, so that we could target some of our CSS a little differently for, say, phones in portrait orientation than on a 27-inch monitor. So a whole bunch of information here. Let's go to General Grid. So you can use as much or as little as Foundation as you want to, as much or as little of Foundation as you want to. But the grid is one of the more basic components that's really handy. It basically splits the page into 12 columns. And then we can sort of specify how many of those 12 columns a given thing should fill. So last time we had some CSS that manually set something to, I think, 80% of the screen width. We're going to use the grid system to do something kind of similar this time. We want all our stuff to be in a div that takes up the middle 8 of those 12. So there'll be 2 empty columns to the left, 2 empty columns to the right. So 4 plus 8 is 12. So that's what we're going to do. And here's a page all about it. They've got a nice little video with some sort of Yeti or something. Or maybe it's a Wampa. Basics. Start by adding an element with a class of row. Okay. So in our body, let's add a div with a class of row. This will create a horizontal block to contain vertical columns. Then add elements with a column class within that row. Specify the widths of each column with the small dash number, medium dash number, and large dash number classes. Okay. So if we say div with a class of medium 8, and it says to add a column class as well. So div class medium column. What that means is for medium screens and larger, this should take up 8 columns. If I put small something else, like small 12, it would say for small screens and larger, make this take up all 12. Start with the smallest first, because the larger rules will override that. So if I say small 12, medium 8, at medium size and larger, it will be 8, not 12, even though obviously medium fits within small or larger. But if you do have a rule for the bigger size, it'll use that when appropriate. By leaving small out, we're sort of implicitly saying small should just take up the whole thing. So we'll see this in practice in just a minute. Okay, then we need a column class. Notice this, it says by default, the column class has an alias columns. So column is the real one, columns is the alias. The funny thing is almost all of their examples say columns. Doesn't matter which one you use really, but column is apparently canonical. So let's just make this and let's stick an H1 in there. Dinoplasty. And let's check it out. All right. Let's inspect this. All right, looks like this div is only taking up about 2/3. I can see from the blue highlight. So it's taking up 8 of the 12 columns, but it's not the middle 8. I want the middle 8. So let's make that happen. I could put another column or another div that's 2 columns wide before it, but we have a better way to do that. Looking at the documentation, if I scroll down, there's a section on offsets. Move blocks up to 11 columns to the right by using classes like large offset 1, small offset 3. So I want medium offset 2. Oops. Medium offset 2. So I want 8 columns shifted 2 columns over. That way I'll have 2, 8, and 2, and it'll be the middle 8. You dig? If that's right, let's refresh. Now let's hover over this down here again. Yeah, looks like that thing's centered. Cool. Next, let's make a form. You guys are old pros at this now. So underneath the H1, I'm going to make a form. This action attribute it wants to put in there by default, that's where you would put the URL of a backend script that you want to submit the form to. We're handling all of this on the client side, so we'll just take that attribute all the way out. We're going to prevent default anyway, so nothing would have happened. Okay. Inside the form, we're going to put a text input and a submit button. You know how to do it. Input, type equals text. Let's give it a name. Dino name. For the sake of fitting this all on screen, I'm going to put line breaks in between my attributes. Whoops. And indent them. And I'm going to put the closing angle bracket aligned with the beginning of the tag, so it's easier to tell where that is. If you do put line breaks in the middle of your tags like this, for the sake of readability, this seems to be the most common way that people indent them, so that's what I'm going to do. You see it a fair amount in React, so I'm just going to get in the habit now. Because I'm not done putting attributes on this thing. Instead of labels this time, let's use a placeholder. Some of you used placeholder in your homework. Placeholder, name, a dinosaur. And let's just go ahead and refresh the page and check that out. Yay! It's an input. Let's zoom in there a little. Name a dinosaur. Start typing. That placeholder goes away. Backspace over it. Placeholder comes back. Cool? Yeah.
I was going to say, like, where does dino name the word appear again?
Well, nowhere yet. So by giving a name to an input, we'll be able to access it from the form in the DOM. Right? So after we submit the form, if we want to get that text box out of the form, we could say form.dinoname. We'll get there. We give it a name so we can refer to it later. If you want to name it something else, it doesn't really matter. Just remember what it is. So let's add a button. Not just any button, but a submit button. Type equals submit. If we didn't have type equals submit, it would be a regular button, and while we could listen for it to be clicked, it wouldn't count as submitting the form. So let's make sure it's a submit button. And in between the opening and closing tags, the text of our button, I'm going to say add dyno refresh again, see it show up. There it is. Now, saw a little of that responsiveness in action there. Let's look at this. When this reaches a certain width, it gives me the 8 columns in the middle. When I get narrow enough, it starts taking up the full width. Because only at medium sizes and larger does it take up 8. So that's what that does. Now this is still pretty wide for small, but that's because I'm zoomed in so far with the font sizes. So that makes it seem like it's a narrower screen than it is. All right. Now our button doesn't have any border around it. This silly flat trend. If we look at Foundation, it has some classes built in for buttons. Let's look at the documentation here. If I make this wide enough. So I see there's some stuff for forms. I'm going to keep that in mind. Controls, that sounds like that's where buttons would be. Click controls. Sure enough, button. Buttons are convenient tools. Yeah, we know what buttons are. Basics, blah, 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 blah. Tells us about type equals button versus type equals submit. Here we go. Ooh, different colors and things. Okay, you can make them different sizes. Coloring. Add color classes to give buttons additional meaning. Primary, secondary, success, alert, warning. If you look at these examples, we have button primary, button secondary, button success. I like button success for our purposes. Sound all right to you? So if you put class equals button space success on our button, now I'm going to go ahead and indent this like we did the other one. Class equals button success. Different classes separated by space inside the attribute. Refresh, having changed nothing else. And now we've got a nice green button. But you know what I'd really like? I kind of want that button to be hugging the right side of the input instead of on a line by itself. Have a nice little inline thing going on. So look at Foundation. Back under General, we saw Forms. Forms. All right, so there's a ton of stuff you can do to style your forms using Foundation. Inline labels and buttons, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to inline this button. To attach extra text or controls to the left or right of an input field. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to attach this button to the right side of the input field. Wrap the elements in an input group container. Then add the following classes to the elements inside. Okay, so input group around the whole thing. So inside the form, around both the input and the button, let's make a div. Class equals input hyphen group. Let's indent all of this. Then add these classes to the elements inside. A class of input group field on the text field. So my input here, I'm going to put class equals input group field. An input group button, it says place the button inside this wrapper. So let's look at their example. They do have a nice example here. A div with a class of input group button, and then the actual button goes inside that. So you don't put this class right on the button, you put it on a div around the button. So after the input, let's put div with a class of input group button. Indent my button. Don't forget the closing tag for that div. Okay. So we have a div with a class of input group, and inside that, we have an input with a class of input group field. And after that, we have a div with a class of input group button. And inside that, we have the actual button. Then we close this div. Then we close this div. And let's see how it looks. Oh yeah, look at that. I like it. That's more like it. And it works at all sizes. Yay. Woohoo. Before I commit that, we're probably going to want to get to this form again later with JavaScript. Perhaps we should put an ID on it. Let's just call it dyno-form. Add our changes to stage them. Add dinosaur form. Very good. Now, it doesn't do anything yet, does it? We'll have to do something about that.